All right, welcome everyone. My name is Cassandra Hori. I'm Assistant Vice Provost and Director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Outreach. And Jen?
I'm Jen Weaver, Associate Director for University Teaching. Nice to see you all.
Thank you so much for joining us for the first of our conversations on inclusive teaching for this summer. Today, we're going to be talking about inclusive teaching through active and collaborative learning. We have some resources, which I'll post the link. We'll share this again later on for folks who join a bit later in Box, which includes a PDF of the slides as well as some other resources. So today, our plan is to do a little introductory material for the whole series, some frameworks and helpful definitions, as well as how to engage. We'll then have probably about 18 minutes or so, quick overview of active and collaborative learning, which we hope will give you a better sense of the evidence behind these techniques, what they might entail, and some of our best strategies for beginning to implement them. We'll then have a couple of opportunities to do some self-inventories and kind of think about the next steps for applying some of these concepts and methods in your classes. And finally, we'll have a chance for some additional discussion, questions, and sharing of resources.
All right, so I wanted to start by sharing how you can engage with us today. And we're going to be using a lot of slides that I encourage you to take and use in your courses and classes as well. So this is something that we like to use at the beginning of all of our workshops, courses, TA training, etc., everything. So one, please change your Zoom name to your preferred name. So for example, I prefer Jen over Jennifer, so that's my Zoom name. Add your pronouns to your Zoom name if you'd like. Cassandra and I have ours added to our Zoom names, and ours are she, her. Please ask questions, and you can do that either in chat or asking aloud or both. Turn on your video if you feel comfortable doing so. I like to include this at the beginning of my classes just as a friendly reminder to my students that I really like to see their faces if they feel comfortable doing so. Critically think about our modeled and suggested techniques and strategies that you can be using in your classes. And again, please feel free to ask those clarifying questions about how to best incorporate them into your class. And take space, make space. We love to hear questions and engage with you. And please make sure you're making space for others to do the same. So those are some ideas of how you can engage with us today. All right, so we wanted to do set some, I guess, sort of shared terminology for the whole series, and especially for today. First, diversity and inclusion. So diversity is sort of about who's here. It's the perspectives, the lived experiences, the identities that we're seeing in our classroom or that we're seeing at our institutions. So in our class, it's who's showing up in our classes. At the institutional level, it might be who's admitted to undergraduate or graduate school. So diversity is a little bit about those numbers, the perspectives, the diversity of students that we see in our classes. What's really important is the concept of inclusion. So how can we make them feel such that they have that sense of belonging, that they can engage, that they have that safety in asking those questions, admit when they don't know something. So it's whose contributions are valued and who receives the message that they belong. So we're really aiming for that in our classes, that inclusive classroom environment. Some other terminology that we want to introduce you to, and what this is a figure that you may have seen elsewhere in different formats. We really like this figure in exemplifying the differences between equality, equity, and justice, or equal opportunity for success in our classroom. So the term equality, treating everyone the same, this really promotes fairness only if everyone has the same needs or is starting from the same place. So as you can see in this slide, we have students or children or whoever watching a baseball game. And equality might mean that we're all giving them a box to stand on. That's only going to be helpful for them if they're starting from the same place and allowing them to see in that baseball game. So here you see that giving them those boxes does not allow everyone to see the baseball game. And we could also say that this doesn't allow everyone to engage in our class in the same way. Equity might be another term that you see often. So this is providing what's needed for success. Here the focus is more on the outcome. And so you see in this figure that it might be providing those different boxes to students or children or whoever to see the baseball game or to engage in our classes. The caveat with this is that we might see this in terms of giving certain students more resources or a boot camp or extra things to do to make sure they're all on the same page if they have different levels of prior knowledge. The issue with this is that it might be adding, if we're adding up boot camp or extra resources to students, they're having to do that on top of the classes and trying to engage and be successful in the classes they currently have. So while it does help for them in terms of being able to engage and be successful, it's not quite answering the full question of how we can create an inclusive classroom. Accessibility is more related to accommodations, related to disabilities. Universal design for learning might be another term you've heard, and we're really going to cover this in the 4th session of this series, where we look at universal design for learning. So what kind of figure can we look at, or what can we be doing for our classrooms? This is about justice or equal opportunity for success. So this is really about, let's take down that fence. So what can we be doing to change the structure in our classroom, how we're engaging our students, such that we're removing barriers, changing the classroom, changing the way that we teach, such that we can be engaging all students in our class. So just some terminology and some concepts that I think sort of give us an equal footing as we start in this series of inclusive teaching. And so thinking about that in terms of the concepts we're talking about on the next slide. Perfect. We're looking at inclusive teaching within this series. So we're building on evidence-based teaching. What does the evidence say? What are the general practices that we see used for good teaching in the classroom? We're also building on what we see in anti-racist teaching, also known as liberation pedagogy, in terms of the more activist framework and how can we be dismantling the systemic racism that we see in society, and what are the pedagogical tools that we can be using from that. And we'll be focusing on, within this Venn diagram, inclusive teaching. So what are the strategies that we can be using that reduce or eliminate the gaps between historically marginalized and historically dominant groups? What can we be doing in our teaching? So hopefully that gives you a bit of a framework and shows you where we're coming from in laying out the next 4 sessions of this inclusive teaching series. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cassandra.
Thank you, Jen. So on the theme of active learning, we are actually going to ask you a question to start off today. Why might active learning methods also be inclusive? We'll do this as a chat box flood. You can begin to type a few words as an answer, but wait to press enter until I do the countdown. I'll give you 10 or 15 seconds to start to write a quick response. Just a few words is fine. Why do you think active learning is also potentially inclusive? Go ahead and open that chat and take a look at the answers that are coming in. Yes, so I'm seeing some responses that really get at that idea that everyone is participating, more students are participating in the kinds of strategies that you're anticipating we're going to be discussing. And the second piece that I see coming through in your answers is that the instructor, you might be getting some additional information back from your students, which can help then adjust, tailor, change the pace a little bit, respond to specific points of confusion that students might be having. So what we just did was a pretty quick exercise, less than a minute or so, but it got you to form a hypothesis. I actually know more about where you're coming from with this exercise. And it's just one example of the kinds of methods that you can bring in when you're in person and don't have access to the chat box like we do in Zoom. You could do something very similar by asking students to think for a moment and then asking for a few examples, giving them a little bit of wait time to process the question, or even adding their text into a shared document, which you could display or be looking at in the classroom itself. So as we have learned much more about the ways in which active learning can also be inclusive, we're at a point now where there are enough decades of research that the message has become pretty clear. Active learning is evidence-based for the vast majority of students. And what we see in the left panel in this slide is a meta-analysis from 2014, looking at, again, many studies that had happened in the decades before that, comparing classes with active learning that is structured, elements in class time where students are all engaging in a particular way with the content, compared to lecture-only class time STEM environments. And what's fallen out of that type of research is pretty consistent, that end results in terms of grades improve in those classes significantly across the board. That's true when we disaggregate by discipline, as well as different kinds of classes. And then the other thing that changes is just passing rates, right? More students actually pass those classes. On the right is another just sample bit of data from a very, again, large meta-analysis that just came out last year, specifically looking at the equity effect of active learning. So again, the meta-analysis included prior studies that had a case of a lecture only and a case of active learning for the same courses, where they could actually compare scores and pass rates and things like that. And they found consistently that those active learning classes decreased the achievement gaps between historically minoritized, historically marginalized students and historically highly represented students in STEM classes specifically. And this study also looked at the amount of active learning in the classes and found a correlation as well with the reduction in achievement gaps and the amount of active learning in classes. So it's a really nice piece of research if you want to find out more. But even before we were getting these kinds of meta-analyses specific to STEM, the evidence was already pretty good, and the kind of reasoning about how people learn for inclusion of active learning. So it's not necessarily a brand new idea. We just have a different kind of evidence about it now that there's been more attention on equity and inclusion and student learning in STEM. So going back to 2000, the book How People Learn was a real kind of watershed moment. It's a National Academy's publication. So here, just a short quote: people construct new knowledge and understanding based on what they already know and believe. So the idea is going back to the ideas of constructivism, which were developed earlier in the 20th century, that you got to do it to learn it, right? And also that we're not coming into learning environments as so-called blank slates. We're always bringing our ideas, and we have to work to revise them to really be learning and building on what we already know. Very excellent book that came out in 2010 called How Learning Works. Learning is not something done to students, but rather something students themselves do. I think this is something in my experience talking with people, we all kind of know and believe this, but putting it into practice is a little more difficult, which is why we're gathered today to explore the practical aspects. And then I really liked the first chapter from a book that's again available in the Caltech library called The Missing Course from Gublar. So helping students learn requires us to create the conditions in which they can revise their previous understandings, and that revision is necessarily an active process. So we can set it up so that students are more likely to delve in and really think about and change their understanding in this kind of active process and way. And these ideas apply the evidence that has led to conclusions really across disciplines. So active learning is, as many of you know, definitely not only a STEM thing, but very much a part of long traditions in humanities and language learning, in the arts, and across all of our disciplines. So there has been some really great research as well, kind of getting under the hood, as the authors of this particular 2014 study phrased it, to try to understand for whom specifically and why might active learning have these especially beneficial effects for historically marginalized and minoritized students. So in this particular study, they took the same class, again, in this case, it was a biology class. About a third of class time in the intervention approach was contributed to active learning or constituted by active learning. There was also pre-class guided reading and some practice that happened before class. And while again, they replicated the results that overall learning improved for students generally in the intervention class compared to a lecture-based class, first-generation college students and Black students had especially large gains in the intervention. And in this case, there were some survey questions that asked students more about their experience, and they were able to hypothesize based on that evidence from students' experiences that some of the mechanisms by which active learning helped students are through time allocation. So the structure helped students distribute their time to lean a little bit more toward before class preparation and also increase the amount of time they spent studying and working on the class overall in a very focused way. And also they experienced some changes in the class culture. They had a greater sense of community, less of a sense of direct competition with other students. And as some of you pointed out in the chat box flood earlier, participation was really more equitable. Students spoke and talked and collaborated in class who felt like they might not otherwise have with a different classroom culture. So getting under the hood is helpful to think about as well. So what are these active learning methods? Well, we've demonstrated at least one of them. Think, pair, share is one that, you know, Jen and I use this a lot, and many of you do as well, asking students to contemplate a question, giving them a little bit of time to think about it individually, perhaps write an answer down, giving them a chance to compare or work together with one or two other students. The pair part gives them a chance to rehearse and practice and check their ideas. And then the whole class is the share, an opportunity to get a few of those ideas and contributions from the different groups who you know are already prepared and ready to go. We're going to do a little bit with the second one here, poll questions, later on in this session today. Poll questions are generally multiple choice or yes, no. You can do these with no tech whatsoever by just a hand raise, or you see in the upper right on the slide, this ABCD card, which can be printed on paper, folded, and students can hold up the side that represents their answer to a multiple choice question. You can also go high tech and either obtain these clicker devices that are like remote controls or various applications that, you know, on a mobile phone or other device, students can enter an answer. And the ones in the lower right-hand corner are called plickers, Plickers, which are printed out papers that students can rotate to show which answer they'd like to enter. And then you with a mobile device, a cell phone or a tablet, can scan the room and actually get a graph of the answers or a record of the answers. So all of those are ways to get students to think about a particular question, commit to an answer, and take that action that constitutes active learning. If you're in an environment where you're doing demonstrations, a quick active learning element is to ask them to make a prediction. They could enter it through a poll or commit to it on paper or share it with a peer, but that thinking process, the hypothesis process, tends to increase the learning that results from the demonstration versus it being more of a passive show. And then minute papers are typically at the end of class, but it's a written active learning moment where you're asking students one or two questions. Often it's what's the most important thing you learned, or what's one insight from today, possibly what's the most confusing thing from today, or what do you have a question about? And it gets students doing a little more metacognition, thinking about the significance of the day, of the work that they've done, and it gives you that information back as an instructor. So all of those can take no more than a couple minutes. They could be extended as well, but they are the pretty quick, relatively easy things to start with, just to increase the amount of active learning. There's some what we're calling next level active and collaborative learning techniques as well. These take maybe a little bit more planning, perhaps a little bit more extended time in class, but they're definitely not things that have to take over the entire class period. And I want to emphasize too, again, that you know, it's not that lecture is bad, but more that active learning is important as well. So I don't think anyone here is saying to never tell students anything. I'm telling you some things right now, and there's absolutely a place for that. So here, pretty familiar, right? Having students break into small groups to discuss a particular question or topic and return to you with conclusions, results, a summary, additional questions, etc. Also for quantitative or other kinds of problem-based work, you can ask students to work together on problems in small groups, to collaborate, to try to solve, contribute different kinds of thinking to the process, help each other get unstuck if they do get a little bit stuck. And all of these are things where you could be circulating, TAs could be circulating to assist. Peer instruction is a kind of next level clicker or poll question technique where students, it was developed by Eric Mazur at Harvard, students are posed often a kind of challenging conceptual question, still multiple choice. They commit to their initial answer after thinking about it, and they then collaborate with one or two neighbors. They try to maybe convince the other neighbor of their answer, work through the logic, come to some agreement, and then they can change their response in a second round of voting or polling. And what the results are often that students do change their understanding, that the work of having to articulate their reasoning and hear from others does a wonderful job of actually shifting those conceptual ideas in a way that really sticks with students. And finally, there's a set of more involved active and collaborative learning. These do take a little bit more planning. They might take a more extended period in class, half an hour to 45 minutes perhaps. So these may or may not be things you would want to do in every class, but they could be happening a few times a term. Certainly some people teach in this way all the time or most of the time as well. One is called the jigsaw method. If you have 4 topics that you want students to learn about, you might split them into 4 groups. Each group specializes in one of those topics, works together to develop their understanding, research, discuss, read, develop kind of a presentation for others. And then you mix the group. So each group has an A, B, C, D person, and they share out that developed information with each other. So the jigsaw method gives students a chance to go deep in a particular topic, and then also have some exposure to a variety of topics in the class. There are also a series of group-based methods that are based on more extensive written guides. So process-oriented guided inquiry learning, POGLE, it's a mouthful, but it's a great method with a lot of materials developed in some STEM fields, especially. Lecture tutorials is another similar approach where students are going to be working through maybe 2, 3, or 4 pages of extended analysis, additional questions, perhaps on a complicated problem topic, field of analysis, etc. The prompts are going to guide them through so each group can work at their own pace and they can seek assistance. You can pull them back together at certain points, but they're kind of guided by what's happening in the worksheet, digital or on paper. So there's a lot more out there. Any of these are ones that you can kind of find out more about, but regardless of what you choose, we have some tips on effectively implementing active and collaborative learning. And the first is to plan and practice. The details of launching these kinds of moments in class really matter in the nuances. And I think they feel a little weird at first, especially if you're much more used to more of a lecture environment, if that's what you experienced as a student, for example. But we don't want that to stop you from trying, because you can always try and adjust. But the best advice I ever received is this, when launching an active or collaborative exercise, share with students the purpose, the process, and the product. So why are you asking them to do this? How is it going to help them learn? I'm going to ask you to do this exercise because I think it's going to help you refine your conceptual understanding because blah, 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 whatever the reason is. The process. Exactly what are you asking them to do? For how long? What are they supposed to do next? Just take away that confusion. Vague is not necessarily great with especially shorter active learning where you want them to get into it and get going. And so this takes away, any confusion or uncertainty. And product, what is the end result? What are they supposed to come back with? What do you want them to be able to share? Again, it takes away some of the confusion and really focuses student effort. And then we have in the box folder that we've shared the link to a couple of times, this is a resource about peer instruction particularly, that has a lot of specific like prompts and things that you might say in this technique. And some of them are just kind of odd. They're not what would fall off of my tongue unless I kind of thought about it. So, now I have a clicker question for you. Please answer on your own. The idea that you're going to give students time, that you need to wait before opening the poll for the first time. Looking at different cases, it goes into like, what if they all vote in one way? What if the votes are split? Interesting, turn to your neighbors, convince them you're right. And so these are phrases that, might just not be what you think of. The wander around the room and listen. That's something to practice and think about how you're going to do that as well, because it's a little different. So just a little forethought, planning, and practice can be really helpful. Two, we're all in a social environment which has inequities built into it. When we come into the classroom, if we're not careful, we can just replicate those same inequities. Who feels comfortable? Who feels like they have more access to speaking roles, to asking questions, to leading in groups? So we suggest that offering neutral suggestions about, for example, who speaks first or who takes certain roles can help us make sure we're not replicating those kinds of biases, as well as defining group roles. So for example, rather than just who feels like they're the one to speak first, whose birthday is soonest, whose name is closest to the end of the alphabet, who's wearing the most blue or orange. Examples of group roles, especially for the longer collaborations. Maybe you could define these differently. Here we have scribe, reporter, and facilitator. But the point is to name the different roles and then have students rotate roles so they don't get locked into what might feel always the most comfortable or a little bit stereotypical for them in terms of their role. And then finally, just tell students why you're doing this. Elsewhere, I think some schools have experienced more resistance from students. We don't see that as much, I think, at Caltech, that if students understand why they're being asked to do something, usually they're pretty on board with it. But there was a really nice study out of Harvard just a couple of years ago that looked at the amount of learning. Again, active learning students learned more, but also asked about their perception. They didn't always feel like they learned more, which was interesting. And just explaining to students why was really important for getting them kind of on board with that feeling of working harder because they're learning actively. So we'll stop the overview there. And I want to invite you to just do a little self-inventory. We are going to launch a Zoom poll that's been adapted from this paper by Kimberly Tanner, about 21 teaching strategies that promote student engagement and cultivate classroom equity.
Okay, so reflecting on what you just thought about that you might want to do and incorporate in your course. We're going to put you in, it's actually going to be a group of 3, so think group share. So for each person in your group, for a course you're planning to teach, or if you're not teaching a course in the upcoming term, maybe the hypothetical course in the future. And we'd like you to discuss the following. 1, what is the one inclusive and active or collaborative method you'd like to incorporate? What questions about planning and or anticipated challenges come to mind? And can the group help answer those questions or challenges? So what we'd like you to do is bring back one of those unresolved questions or challenges that you might have to the larger group to report back out. So the evidence has shown that allowing your students to both reflect or create a plan for projects or for studying or for any learning the concepts that you're teaching in class leads to better learning. So this is the purpose of this exercise that we're asking you to do. Process. We're going to put you in groups of 3. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. I'll give you a warning before I bring you back. And then the product, as we'd like you to talk about these questions in your groups and then bring back some of those challenges and we can try and troubleshoot or problem solve together as a group. In terms of who's sharing, person wearing the darkest shirt goes first. Person wearing the lightest shirt reports back. So that's our reporter with one unresolved question or challenge.
Yeah, thank you for surfacing those challenges and questions. I think they're common ones that people often face, and we hope to have helped you out. There's more in the box folder. These slides are also in there. If you lose the link or anything, we've put it in the chat a couple times, but just let us know. We also have some resources online and would point you to several other pages from other offices at Caltech to gain some other perspectives and support in this process. And then finally, we do have some upcoming, of course, the rest of this series will be here Wednesdays at noon for the next several weeks, talking about assignments and feedback and transparency and universal design for learning. We're going to welcome Suzanne Hall to a couple of those, and Mark Lazar, our accessibility services specialist, for the last one. And then Jen will be leading the faculty summer short course on course design on these 2 dates in September, and it's up on the Caltech website as well. So with that, we very much thank you for spending your noon Pacific time hour with us. We're always here to help and consult more individually as you try to implement and work toward, small changes toward inclusive teaching, more inclusive teaching in your classes. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.